Airmen laughed at old veteran restoring a P-51 Mustang until a lieutenant saw his combat wings. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It's a story of respect, pride, and a quiet veteran who showed that appearances can be deceiving. On a warm, sunny afternoon at the airfield, a group of young airmen stood gathered around a dilapidated P-51 Mustang. The legendary aircraft, a relic of World War II, was being painstakingly restored by an old veteran. His hands, worn with age and experience, carefully worked on the engine, adjusting small parts and checking the oil pressure. The young men watched, laughing to themselves. They saw an old man, a former mechanic, who had no place near their modern, high-tech planes. One of the airmen, a cocky young man named Staff Sergeant Thomas, smirked as he leaned against the hangar door. This old man thinks he can fix a P-51 Mustang? It's ancient, man, Thomas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The others chuckled, clearly enjoying the spectacle of the elderly man attempting something they assumed was beyond him. The old veteran, whose name was Frank Harrison, didn't seem to mind the ridicule. His weathered face remained calm as he worked, but there was an unmistakable fire behind his eyes. He wasn't just restoring a plane. He was reliving history, a history that these young airmen would never fully understand. Frank had served in combat during World War II, flying alongside some of the best pilots the world had ever seen. He had earned his stripes and his combat wings long ago, but to these airmen, he was just a relic of the past. As Frank tightened a bolt on the P-51 Mustang's engine, another airman walked over, pretending to examine the plane. "Hey, old man," the airman said with a grin. "You ever actually flown one of these? Or are you just here for the nostalgia?" Frank paused for a moment, looking up at the young man, but didn't answer. Instead, he simply continued with his work. The young airman's smirk faltered, but he shrugged and walked away. The rest of the group continued to mock Frank from a distance, not realizing the depth of the man's experience. As they laughed, Frank's mind drifted back to a time when he was a young man, flying in combat, facing the dangers of the skies with nothing but his skill and the trust of his comrades. He had earned his combat wings during some of the most dangerous missions of the war. He had saved lives, destroyed enemy aircraft, and made it through the impossible. But none of that seemed to matter here. The airmen's laughter was a reminder that time had a way of erasing the past, even for those who had sacrificed everything. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine cut through the air. A black sedan pulled up to the hangar, and a lieutenant stepped out, wearing the insignia of a higher rank. The young airmen stopped laughing, their attention suddenly drawn to the lieutenant. The man walked up to the old veteran, his steps firm and deliberate. "Excuse me, sir," the lieutenant said, his tone now respectful. "I couldn't help but notice that you're working on a P-51 Mustang." Frank turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice steady and calm. The lieutenant paused, studying Frank for a moment. "You wouldn't happen to be Frank Harrison, would you? The veteran who earned his wings in the Pacific?" Frank's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time that day, the airmen fell silent. They had been so busy mocking the old man that they hadn't noticed the weight of his history. The lieutenant's recognition was the first sign of respect Frank had received all day. He stood a little straighter as the lieutenant continued. "I've heard stories about you, about your incredible skill and your courage under fire. You're a living legend." The airmen stood frozen, realizing that they had been laughing at someone far greater than they could ever understand. The lieutenant turned to them, his gaze cold and unwavering. "This man isn't just some old mechanic," he said, his voice loud and commanding. "He's a war hero, and I suggest you show him the respect he deserves." The young airman, who had once laughed and mocked Frank, now stood in stunned silence, unable to speak. The lieutenant turned back to Frank, offering a salute. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you," he said. Frank nodded slowly, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. He had never sought recognition or respect. All he had ever wanted was to restore the planes that had once flown beside him. But in that moment, he realized that sometimes, respect comes when you least expect it. The old veteran continued his work on the P-51 Mustang, but the laughter from the airmen had stopped. They had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of a true hero, no matter how old they may be. The lieutenant's words hung in the air, and the once cocky airmen stood in stunned silence, still processing the gravity of what had just been revealed to them. Frank Harrison, the old veteran they had mocked and dismissed, wasn't just any mechanic. He was a man who had lived through history, a legend in the skies. The airmen exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. It was clear now that Frank was more than they could have ever imagined. The lieutenant, sensing the shift in the air, gave Frank a respectful nod before turning to the young men. You all better take a long, hard look at this plane. This P-51 Mustang, the lieutenant said, his voice strong, was part of history. And so is the man working on it. He turned back to Frank, who had returned to his task, as calm and focused as ever. The veteran's weathered hands moved with precision, as if the decades of experience had made him one with the aircraft. Frank, the lieutenant continued, now addressing him directly. Would you mind showing the airmen how you do it? Frank didn't hesitate. Without a word, he stepped back and gestured toward the Mustang, inviting the young men to take a closer look. The moment was surreal for the airmen. They had thought Frank was just an old man lost in the past, but now they realized they had been standing before a giant. Someone who had fought in the skies when they had only read about it in books. Frank motioned to the engine, showing them a small but critical part of the aircraft. This piece here, the carburetor's main linkage, he said quietly, is where it always fails if you don't maintain it right. You guys have probably never seen one of these before, but this little piece is the reason the Mustang won World War II. The airmen stood in awe as Frank continued, guiding them through the restoration process with ease. His explanations were simple, but his confidence and expertise were undeniable. The young men watched, captivated by the man who had been so underestimated. They had no idea that a man with such a quiet demeanor had once flown over enemy territory, saving countless lives and leading missions that had changed the course of history. As Frank finished his adjustments and tightened the final bolts on the engine, he stepped back, surveying the P-51 Mustang with satisfaction. That should do it, he said, his voice steady. One of the airmen, Private Sanders, looked over at the lieutenant, a mix of guilt and admiration in his eyes. Sir, he said, his voice a little hesitant, I think we owe him an apology. The lieutenant nodded, acknowledging the sentiment. I think you're right, he replied. It's not every day you meet a real hero. The airmen, one by one, walked up to Frank, offering their apologies in various forms. Some mumbled their regret, while others simply nodded in respect. But it wasn't until Sanders stepped forward and offered a hand to Frank that the old veteran truly saw the change in them. Sanders' hand trembled slightly as he extended it, but Frank took it firmly, his grip still strong despite his age. I'm sorry, sir, Sanders said, his voice sincere. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you had done. Frank smiled faintly, his blue eyes softening. It's all right, son, he replied. You didn't know, but you learned, and that's all that matters. The Mustang's engine roared to life, the sound echoing through the hangar. The young men couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as they watched the plane come to life before their eyes. It was more than just a piece of machinery. It was a symbol of the bravery, skill, and dedication of the men who had flown it. The lieutenant looked at Frank once more, his respect now fully earned. You're not just a mechanic, Frank, he said. You're a living legend. Frank gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the truth in the lieutenant's words, but his expression remained humble. He had never sought recognition. His pride came not from the accolades, but from knowing he had done his part, even when the world had forgotten. As the young airman filed out of the hangar, Frank stayed behind, his work on the Mustang finally complete. He didn't need their applause or thanks. The work, the history, and the legacy of the aircraft were all that mattered. And as he stood there, watching the Mustang sit proudly in the hangar, Frank Harrison knew that, in his own quiet way, he had left his mark on the world. The airmen stood in awe, watching as the P-51 Mustang idled, its engine humming steadily in the hangar. The moment was surreal. The same men who had laughed at Frank Harrison, the old mechanic, were now standing in complete silence, their expressions filled with respect and disbelief. They had learned the hard way that respect couldn't be earned through arrogance. It had to be earned through actions. As Frank stepped back from the plane, his hands wiped clean of grease and oil, the lieutenant approached him again. "Sir, I just want to say thank you," the lieutenant said, his voice genuine. "I don't think we would have gotten that engine running without you. You truly know your way around these machines." Frank nodded, but he didn't smile. He wasn't one to seek praise. "It's just about doing it right," Frank said softly. "This Mustang, this old bird, it's seen things. It deserves to be treated right." The lieutenant gave a short, appreciative nod, but it was clear that he wasn't the only one who had been impacted by Frank's quiet wisdom. The young airmen, one by one, approached Frank, each of them offering a word of thanks or an apology for their earlier behavior. It was a humbling experience for all of them. As they stood there, some of the younger airmen seemed to want to say something more, but their words failed them. What could they say to someone like Frank? To a man who had been part of the very fabric of history? Their words felt inadequate. A few moments of silence passed before Frank turned to the Mustang, as if he had sensed the tension in the room. "I'll leave you all to it," he said quietly. "This bird is ready. She'll fly again when you need her." He gave the plane one last lingering look before turning to leave. But just as he walked toward the hangar doors, the lieutenant called out to him. "Sir, where will you go from here?" Frank stopped and turned back. The question was innocent enough, but it lingered. The young lieutenant was genuinely curious, but it also carried an undertone of respect that had grown in the last hour. Frank hesitated before answering, his voice low but firm. "I'll be around," he said simply. "I don't need to go anywhere." The lieutenant nodded, but before he could speak, Frank was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the hangar, as quietly as he had come. The airmen stood still, unsure of what to do next. It was one thing to work on the planes, to repair and maintain them, but Frank's presence had been something more. It had been a reminder that even in the modern age of aviation, there were still men who had lived through the blood and sweat of the past, men whose actions had shaped the very history they now took for granted. As the last of the airmen filed out of the hangar, the Mustang stood there in the quiet, a testament to both the past and the future. Frank's work had left a mark, not just on the aircraft, but on the men who had witnessed his skill and humility. For them, it wasn't just about repairing a plane. It was about understanding the legacy of those who had come before them, the sacrifices they had made, and the pride they carried in their hearts. The airmen left the hangar with a newfound respect, not only for the P-51 Mustang, but for the man who had restored it to life. They understood now that heroes don't always wear medals or stand in the spotlight. Sometimes, they are the ones who work quietly in the background, leaving their mark in ways that are impossible to measure. Frank Harrison had reminded them of that. As the hangar doors closed behind them, the sound of the Mustang's engine still echoed in the air, a sound that would stay with them for a long time to come. It was the sound of respect earned, of a job well done, and of a legacy that would never be forgotten. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the airfield, the Mustang sat quietly in its hangar, the sleek silver frame reflecting the soft morning light. The engine hummed as if it were eager to take to the skies once more. The airmen, now with a deep sense of respect for the old veteran, slowly gathered around the plane. They had spent the night in reflection, talking amongst themselves about what had happened the day before. Some of them still couldn't believe that the man they had mocked had turned out to be someone they could only aspire to be. As they stood in front of the Mustang, Staff Sergeant Thomas, the one who had mocked Frank the most, stepped forward. He looked up at the aircraft, his face full of admiration. "I've never seen anything like it," Thomas said, his voice full of sincerity. The way he worked on that plane, like it was a part of him. It was like magic. One of the other airmen, Private Sanders, nodded. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Frank's been through so much more than we could ever imagine. And yet, he never asked for any recognition." There was a long pause as the airmen looked at each other. For the first time, they all understood the true meaning of respect. It wasn't something that could be earned with rank or accolades. It was something that came with time, with sacrifice, and with a willingness to serve, no matter the cost. Just then, the lieutenant arrived, his boots clicking on the concrete floor as he walked toward the group. "All right, everyone. It's time to see what this Mustang can really do, he said, a proud smile on his face. The airmen looked at each other, excitement building as they prepared to take the plane out for a test flight. They had spent hours the day before going over the maintenance checks and reviewing the engine's performance. Everything was ready. They just needed to see it in action. The lieutenant motioned for Frank to join them, and the old man, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward. "You know, Frank," the lieutenant said, his tone respectful, "we wouldn't be here without you. You've earned this." Frank smiled softly, his blue eyes reflecting the pride he felt in the aircraft he had once flown. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," Frank said, quietly. "But this Mustang, she's something special." With that, the airman and Frank climbed into the plane, the engine roaring to life as the propeller spun. Frank took his place in the cockpit, and for a moment, everything went quiet. The young men, who had once dismissed Frank as just an old mechanic, now realized they were in the presence of a living legend. The Mustang taxied down the runway, its wheels lifting off the ground with ease. As the plane soared into the sky, the young airmen could feel the power and grace of the aircraft beneath them. It was a moment they would never forget. They watched as Frank flew the Mustang with precision, his hands steady on the controls, guiding the plane through the air like it was an extension of himself. The lieutenant, seated next to Frank, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Frank's skill and experience were beyond anything they could have imagined. This is what it's all about, the lieutenant thought, watching Frank maneuver the Mustang through the clouds. This is the legacy of the men who flew these planes. After a few moments, Frank brought the Mustang back in for a smooth landing, the wheels touching the runway with the same precision they had taken off with. The plane came to a stop, and the group of airmen stood in awe, watching as Frank powered down the engine. They had seen firsthand the true power of the Mustang and the man who had brought it back to life. As the airmen climbed out of the plane, Frank was already walking away, his job done. But this time, there was no mockery, no laughter. There was only respect. They knew that Frank Harrison wasn't just a mechanic. He was a hero, a man who had lived through history and had the courage to continue living it every day. As they watched him walk into the hangar, the airmen realized that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen the true meaning of service, of duty, and of legacy. Frank had reminded them that heroes didn't always need to be in the spotlight. Sometimes, they were the ones who worked quietly in the background, making sure that the past wasn't forgotten and that the future had something to stand on. The Mustang, now resting in the hangar, would live on as a symbol of the past, but it was Frank's legacy that would stay with them forever. The Mustang sat in the hangar, its polished exterior reflecting the afternoon light as the airmen gathered around it. The engine was silent now, but the hum of its power still lingered in the air, a reminder of the incredible flight they had witnessed just hours before. The young airmen stood there, a group that had once laughed at Frank Harrison, the old mechanic, but now regarded him with something entirely different: respect. Staff Sergeant Thomas, the man who had mocked Frank the most, stood a little apart from the group, his hands tucked into his pockets. The once cocky young airman now felt like a man who had been humbled, and it was something he wasn't quite sure how to process. He had seen Frank work on the Mustang, seen the way the old man had handled the aircraft like it was an extension of himself. He had felt the raw power of the plane as it soared into the sky, and he had realized something that no one had bothered to teach him before. True skill wasn't something you earned by being the loudest in the room. It was something you earned through quiet competence, through years of dedication, and a willingness to put in the work when no one else was watching. "I didn't know," Thomas muttered under his breath, looking at the Mustang. "I didn't know what it really meant." Private Sanders, who had been more receptive to Frank's presence, looked at Thomas. "None of us did," he said quietly. "We saw him as just an old man, but we didn't see the history behind him." Thomas nodded, his eyes focused on the Mustang as though it were speaking to him. "I was wrong. We were all wrong," he admitted. "That man has seen things none of us will ever experience. And he's still doing it." The lieutenant, who had been standing off to the side, overheard the conversation and approached the group. "It's not about being right or wrong," he said. "It's about learning from the past, learning from the men who paved the way for all of us. Frank is a part of that history, and now you all are too." There was a pause as the young men took in the lieutenant's words. It was clear now that The airmen weren't just working on machines. They were part of a legacy that extended far beyond their own time. Just then, Frank walked back into the hangar, his steps slow but steady. He had been in the office, finishing up some paperwork, but now he was back, ready to check on the Mustang once more. The airman stood a little straighter as he approached, not out of fear, but out of respect. Frank looked at the plane, his eyes scanning it with the same precision he had used when he worked on it. "She's a good bird," he said quietly. "You've all done a fine job with her." The airmen exchanged looks. Frank was humble, as always, but his approval meant more than they could say. They had earned it, and they knew it. "Sir," Sanders began, stepping forward, "we just wanted to say thank you. For everything." Frank turned to him, his blue eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said, shaking his head. "I just did what I had to do. It's you young men who will carry this legacy forward. It's your turn now." The airman nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Frank wasn't just talking about the Mustang. He was talking about the responsibility that came with being a part of something bigger than themselves. As the day wore on, the airmen worked together, finishing the last of the Mustang's maintenance and preparing it for its next flight. There was a sense of camaraderie among them, a unity that had not been there before. They had learned something from Frank, something that would stay with them for the rest of their careers: humility, respect, and the importance of understanding the history that had shaped them. The lieutenant watched them for a moment, a proud smile crossing his face. He knew that this experience had changed them, had turned them from a group of young, arrogant airmen into something more, a team, a family, bound together by a shared understanding of what it truly meant to serve. Later that evening, as the hangar lights dimmed and the airmen left for the night, Frank stayed behind, sitting quietly on a bench. He didn't need the recognition, but he was content knowing that the Mustang would fly again, and that the men who flew it would honor the legacy of those who had come before them. He had done his part, and that, to him, was enough. The next day, the hangar was alive with energy. The sun shone brightly outside, but inside, there was a hum of excitement and anticipation. The airmen were preparing for their first mission with the P-51 Mustang fully restored, but this time, they weren't just going through the motions. They were doing it with a newfound respect for the legacy of the plane and its history. Frank Harrison had left early that morning, not to retire from the work, but to go about his business quietly as he always did. He had no need for recognition, but the airmen were determined to honor him in their own way. As the Mustang sat in the center of the hangar, its gleaming exterior looked like a symbol of something much greater than just a machine. It was a reminder of the men who had flown it, of the lives it had touched, and of the history it carried with it. Staff Sergeant Thomas stood in front of the plane, his hands on his hips. His expression was thoughtful, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about what he could achieve or what others would think of him. All he could think about was Frank, the old man who had restored the Mustang, and how little he had truly known about the men who had come before him. "I can't believe it," Thomas muttered to himself. He never said much, but you could tell by the way he worked, by the way he handled that plane. He was a part of something far bigger than all of us. Private Sanders, who had come to understand Frank's quiet strength, stood next to him. "He taught us more than just how to fix an engine," Sanders said, his voice calm but filled with respect. "He taught us about the pride that comes from service, from knowing you've done something for the greater good, even when no one's watching." The lieutenant overheard the conversation and walked over, a knowing smile on his face. "You're both right," he said. Frank didn't need to say much because his actions spoke louder than words. He's seen more than most of us could ever imagine. And yet, he carries himself with humility, never seeking praise. That's the kind of service we should all strive for. As the airmen nodded in agreement, they couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose that had been missing before. They weren't just restoring a plane. They were becoming a part of something bigger, a part of a tradition that stretched back through the decades. Frank's work had reminded them of what it truly meant to serve. The morning passed quickly as the airmen prepared the Mustang for its flight. They double-checked every component, made sure every bolt was tightened, and ensured that the engine was ready for takeoff. But there was a difference in the air today. It wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about honoring the history and the men who had flown before them. When the time came for the Mustang to take to the skies, the lieutenant gave the orders, and the airmen lined up to watch. The plane's engine roared to life, and for a moment, the world outside the hangar seemed to disappear. It was just the Mustang, the sky, and the men who had been entrusted with its care. As the plane soared into the air, a sense of pride washed over the group. This wasn't just any plane. It was a piece of history, a piece of the past that had been brought back to life, not just through mechanical skill, but through respect, humility, and a dedication to something greater than themselves. The Mustang circled the airfield once before coming back in for a smooth landing. The airmen watched as it touched down, its wheels skimming the runway before coming to a complete stop. The lieutenant turned to them, his eyes gleaming with pride. "That's how it's done," he said. "You didn't just fix a plane today. You honored a legacy. And that's what it's all about." The airmen stood in silence for a moment, taking in the full weight of his words. They had learned something important that day, something that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. It wasn't just about being the best or the fastest. It was about understanding the value of what you were doing, understanding that the work you put in today would affect generations to come. As the group slowly began to disperse, Staff Sergeant Thomas lingered behind, looking at the Mustang with a newfound respect. He could hear Frank's quiet words echoing in his mind, "It's just about doing it right." And in that moment, Thomas realized that it wasn't just about the planes. It was about doing things with integrity, with purpose, and with the knowledge that your actions could leave a lasting impact. The young airmen had come a long way since their first encounter with Frank, and they knew they had a long way to go. But with the Mustang restored and the lessons they had learned from Frank still fresh in their minds, they felt ready to face whatever came next. The legacy of the past was alive and well, and they were determined to carry it forward. Days passed, and the hangar that had once been a place of routine maintenance and mechanical work now felt different. The airmen moved with a new sense of purpose, each step infused with the lessons they had learned from Frank Harrison. They no longer saw themselves just as soldiers working on machines. They saw themselves as part of a legacy, a chain that connected them to the past. Staff Sergeant Thomas, who had once been the loudest in mocking Frank, now found himself reflecting on the old veteran's quiet wisdom. He still worked with the team, but there was something deeper in his approach now, a respect for the history that had shaped him, a respect for the men who had come before him, and a desire to be more than just a soldier in the line of duty. One morning, as the group gathered in the hangar for another day of training, the lieutenant called them together. "All right, men," he began, his voice strong and steady. "Today, we're going to put all the skills we've learned to the test. But this isn't just about the Mustang or any of the machines we work on. This is about what you've learned from Frank, about humility, about dedication, and about doing things the right way, no matter what." The airmen exchanged glances, the weight of the lieutenant's words sinking in. They had heard these lessons before, but now they were truly starting to understand them. The Mustang was ready for its next mission, and it would be their job to ensure that it performed perfectly. But this time, they weren't just focusing on the technical aspects of the plane. They were focused on doing it right, honoring the legacy of those who had flown it before them, and ensuring that their work reflected the values that Frank had taught them. The day passed quickly as the team worked together, meticulously checking every system and making sure everything was in perfect working order. The lieutenant kept a close eye on the team, but he didn't need to say much. The airmen were working with a sense of pride and purpose that they had never had before. The Mustang's engine hummed smoothly as they made their final preparations, the sound of it bringing a sense of calm to the team. This wasn't just a routine mission. This was a test of everything they had learned. The airmen gathered outside as the sun began to set, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink. The Mustang was lined up on the runway, ready for takeoff. It had been a long road to get to this point, but they had made it. Staff Sergeant Thomas stood at the edge of the runway, looking at the plane with a mixture of awe and respect. The plane wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had been taught, of hard work, dedication, and respect. The engine roared to life as the pilot took their seat, and the Mustang slowly began to move down the runway. The airmen stood in silence, watching as the plane gained speed. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, the sound of the engine cutting through the air like a heartbeat. The Mustang soared into the sky, its wings cutting through the clouds with ease. It wasn't just the power of the plane that was remarkable, it was the power of the team that had brought it to life. As the Mustang disappeared into the distance, the airmen stood together, knowing that they had done something extraordinary. They had restored a piece of history, and in doing so, they had learned the value of humility, of legacy, and of serving something greater than themselves. The Mustang's return to the sky wasn't just a victory for the team, it was a victory for all those who had come before them. As they walked back to the hangar, the airmen knew that this wasn't the end. There would be more challenges ahead, more missions to complete, and more lessons to learn. But now, they had something that would guide them through it all: respect for the past, dedication to their craft, and the understanding that every action they took would leave a mark on the legacy they were a part of. Weeks passed since the Mustang's successful test flight, and the hangar had become a place of quiet pride. The airmen no longer saw it just as a place to work on planes. It had become a space where lessons were learned, and where they bonded over more than just their shared duty. The Mustang, still parked in the corner of the hangar, had become a symbol, not only of the work they did but of the journey they had taken together. Staff Sergeant Thomas had transformed more than just his approach to mechanics. He had transformed his entire outlook on service. The arrogance he once carried had been replaced by a quiet humility, and the respect for Frank that had grown in the past few weeks stayed with him. It was a change he hadn't anticipated, but one that felt right. Frank Harrison, the old veteran who had walked into their lives and left an indelible mark, was gone. He hadn't said goodbye, just quietly slipped out of the hangar after the Mustang's first flight. But his presence lingered, woven into the air like the hum of the aircraft's engine. The airmen still spoke of him, still tried to live up to the example he had set. The Mustang had been his final legacy, and now it was theirs to protect and cherish. The day had started like any other, with the airmen arriving at the hangar to begin their morning checks. The smell of engine oil, the sound of tools clicking into place, and the buzz of activity all felt familiar. But today, there was an undercurrent of anticipation. The Mustang, after weeks of maintenance and repairs, was scheduled for another flight, one that would take it outside the confines of the airfield. This time, it wasn't just a routine test flight. It was a mission that, in a way, had been set into motion the day Frank had walked into their lives. The lieutenant gathered the team before the flight. "All right, men," he began, his voice steady. "This mission isn't just about flying a plane. It's about showing everyone what we've learned, not just from Frank, but from each other. This is our chance to prove that we've taken what he taught us, about respect, about skill, about working as a team, and put it into action. We're more than just airmen. We're part of a legacy. Today, we show what that means." The airmen nodded, their expressions serious but determined. This mission, more than any other, was personal. It wasn't just a test of their mechanical skills. It was a test of the lessons they had internalized. They climbed into the cockpit, each of them feeling the weight of the Mustang's history behind them. The plane had been meticulously maintained, but now, it was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of everything they had become. As the Mustang taxied down the runway, the airmen watched from the sidelines, their eyes glued to the plane as it gained speed. It was a quiet moment, a moment where everything they had learned seemed to converge in the roar of the engine and the beating of their hearts. The Mustang lifted off the ground, its wheels leaving the runway behind, and the airmen stood still, watching it disappear into the sky. Staff Sergeant Thomas stood beside the lieutenant, his hands folded behind his back. "I never thought I'd feel this way about a plane," he said softly. "About anything, really. But watching it go up like that, it's different. It feels like a piece of history." The lieutenant nodded, his gaze never leaving the plane. "That's because it is. And so are you. This isn't just about the past. It's about what you're building right now." The Mustang soared high into the air, performing maneuvers that showcased the precision of its restoration. The airmen watched in awe as it cut through the sky, a perfect blend of past and present. It was a testament to Frank's skill and dedication, and now, it was their turn to carry that forward. As the Mustang completed its flight and returned to the airfield, the airmen knew that it wasn't just the aircraft that had been tested. It was them. They had taken the lessons of the past and turned them into something new, something their own. As the Mustang touched down and came to a halt, the team gathered around it, their faces proud. They had done it. They had not only restored a plane, they had restored a piece of history, and in doing so, had forged their own legacy. The lieutenant turned to the team. Well done, men. You've proven what we've all known. This is what it means to serve, to honor the past, to respect it, and to keep moving forward. The airmen nodded, their pride evident. They had learned more than they had ever expected. They had learned that legacy was not just about what you did, but about how you did it, and that sometimes the quietest actions left the loudest impact. As the Mustang sat in the hangar, gleaming in the fading light, the airmen knew that they had become a part of its story, and it a part of theirs. The legacy was alive, and it was theirs to carry forward. As the days passed since the Mustang's successful mission, the team found themselves back in the routine of their duties, but everything felt different now. The airmen had changed. There was a sense of unity between them, a deeper respect not just for their work, but for each other and for the history that they had learned to carry with them. Staff Sergeant Thomas, once the loudest voice in the hangar, now found himself standing quietly by the Mustang, watching the sunlight dance off its sleek body. It was no longer just a machine to him. It was a living piece of history, a symbol of the sacrifices made by the men who had flown it, and a reminder of the lessons they had learned from Frank Harrison. The lieutenant, who had always led with a sense of purpose, now found himself walking the hangar floor with a renewed sense of pride. He had watched his team grow in ways he hadn't expected. They weren't just better mechanics, they were better soldiers. They had learned the value of humility, of doing things the right way, even when no one was watching. And it had made them a stronger, more cohesive team. It's strange, the lieutenant said one afternoon as he watched the team at work, how much one man can change everything. Thomas looked over at him, his hands still working on the engine of another plane. I think it's more about the lessons he taught us than anything else, he said quietly. Frank didn't just fix planes. He fixed something inside all of us. The lieutenant nodded. He reminded us of what it means to serve. Not for recognition, not for glory, but because it's the right thing to do. The Mustang, parked quietly in the corner of the hangar, seemed to echo those words. It was a silent reminder of the legacy that the team had inherited, a legacy of duty, sacrifice, and respect. That evening, as the sun set behind the hangar, the airmen gathered together for a small ceremony. It wasn't something formal. It wasn't something that anyone had planned. It was simply a way for them to honor Frank, the man who had changed their lives without ever asking for anything in return. They stood in front of the Mustang, each of them silently reflecting on the lessons they had learned and the legacy they had inherited. To Frank Harrison, the lieutenant said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, a man who taught us what it truly means to serve, to honor, and to respect. We will carry these lessons with us, no matter where we go. The airmen raised their glasses, a simple but meaningful gesture to the man who had given them so much. As the evening grew darker, they shared stories of their experiences, of the challenges they had faced, and of the lessons they had learned. It was a quiet moment, but one that carried weight. They weren't just remembering Frank's legacy, they were becoming a part of it. The following days brought new challenges. The team faced new missions, new aircraft to repair, and new responsibilities to take on. But now, they approached each task with the knowledge that they weren't just doing their jobs, they were continuing a tradition. Every time they worked on a plane, they thought of Frank. Every time they worked together as a team, they remembered what he had taught them. They were carrying his legacy forward, and that meant something. One afternoon, as they completed a routine check on a new aircraft, the lieutenant called them all together. I've been thinking about something, he said, standing in front of the team. Frank's lessons weren't just about planes. They were about how we carry ourselves, how we treat each other, and how we do our work. The airman nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. So, the lieutenant continued, I want us to remember that, no matter what happens, we're always working for something greater than ourselves. We're not just fixing machines. We're honoring the past, and we're setting an example for the future. Staff Sergeant Thomas looked around at his fellow airmen, feeling a deep sense of pride. They had become more than just a team. They had become a family, bound together not just by their work, but by the lessons they had learned and the legacy they had inherited. It wasn't about the Mustang anymore. It was about who they had become through their service. We've got this, Thomas said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. We've got this, because we know what it means to serve. We know what it means to honor the past. The airmen stood together, the Mustang gleaming in the background as they prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. It didn't matter what came next. They were ready, because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that true service wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter the cost, and honoring the legacy of those who came before them. Months passed, and the hangar had become a place of quiet reflection for the airmen. The lessons Frank had imparted to them were no longer just memories. They had become part of the fabric of who they were as individuals and as a team. The Mustang, now a familiar presence in the hangar, was a constant reminder of the journey they had taken. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of everything they had learned about service, humility, and legacy. Staff Sergeant Thomas, who had once been brash and arrogant, now worked with a quiet determination. He had taken on more responsibility, helping train new airmen and ensuring that the lessons of the past were passed down. The Mustang was no longer the only thing that mattered. It was the team, the brotherhood they had formed, and the way they had come together to honor Frank's legacy. The lieutenant watched them with pride, knowing that the transformation in his team had been far more significant than any mission or task they could have completed. They weren't just following orders anymore. They were thinking for themselves, relying on the lessons they had learned from Frank. One evening, after a long day of maintenance work, the team gathered around a table in the break room. The conversation wasn't about planes or missions. It was about life, about what came next. "I've been thinking," Private Sanders began, breaking the silence, "about how much we've changed, about how much Frank changed us." The others nodded, each of them reflecting on their journey. "He didn't just teach us about planes. He taught us about respect, about doing the right thing even when no one's watching. And he taught us that our work has meaning. It's bigger than us." Staff Sergeant Thomas smiled, the first real smile he'd had in a long time. "I used to think it was all about being the best, getting ahead, making a name for yourself. But now I get it. It's about the work. It's about doing it the right way, because that's what matters. It's about honoring the past and making sure we pass it on to the next generation." The lieutenant, who had been listening quietly, stood up and looked around at the team. "You've all learned something far more valuable than any skill with an engine or a plane. You've learned the true meaning of service. And that's something that will stay with you for the rest of your lives, no matter where you go or what you do." As they sat there, the conversation shifted. They talked about the future, about the direction they would take in their careers and their lives. But no matter where they went, the lessons they had learned would stay with them. They would carry Frank's legacy forward, and they would honor it in everything they did. The next morning, the airmen were called in for a briefing. There was a new mission on the horizon, one that would take them beyond their familiar airfield and into unknown territory. But this time, it wasn't just another task. It was a chance to prove everything they had learned. The Mustang, fully restored and ready for action, was scheduled to be part of the mission. It wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a reminder of what they had accomplished and the lessons they had learned. As the airmen prepared for the mission, Staff Sergeant Thomas found himself standing by the Mustang, his hand resting on its wing. He thought about Frank, about the lessons the old man had taught them, and about how far they had come. They were no longer the same group of airmen who had laughed and mocked Frank in the beginning. They were a team, stronger, wiser, and united by the legacy they carried with them. The mission ahead would be challenging, but they were ready. The Mustang was ready, and they were ready to prove that they could live up to the legacy they had inherited. As the team gathered around the plane for the final briefing, the lieutenant turned to them one last time. "This is more than just a mission," he said, his voice steady. "It's about proving that everything we've learned, everything we've worked for, matters. It's about honoring the legacy of those who have come before us. And it's about showing that we are worthy of carrying that legacy forward." The airmen stood tall, the weight of the lieutenant's words settling into their hearts. They weren't just fixing planes anymore. They weren't just following orders. They were part of something much bigger. And as the Mustang roared to life on the runway, they knew that they were ready to take on whatever came next, together. The day of the mission arrived, and the airfield was bustling with activity. The airmen, now a cohesive unit, were preparing for what was going to be their most important flight yet. They had trained for this, prepared for this, but there was something different in the air today. This wasn't just another mission. It was a chance to prove everything they had learned. Frank Harrison's lessons were woven into their every move. The Mustang, gleaming under the morning sun, was ready to take flight. But this time, the stakes were higher. The team stood together, the weight of their responsibility hanging heavy in the air. They weren't just flying a plane. They were carrying the legacy of the men who had come before them, and of the old mechanic who had taught them what it meant to serve. Staff Sergeant Thomas stood near the Mustang, his eyes scanning the aircraft. It wasn't just a machine to him anymore. It was a living testament to everything they had accomplished. His hands, once quick to mock, now moved with purpose, checking and rechecking every detail. The arrogance that had once been his defining trait had been replaced with a quiet confidence, one that came from knowing that their success wasn't just about skill. It was about the heart and soul they put into their work. The lieutenant walked up to the team, his gaze steady. "Today, we're not just representing ourselves," he said, his voice strong but laced with a quiet pride. "We're representing everything that came before us. We're representing the history of the Mustang, and we're representing Frank's legacy. This mission isn't about glory. It's about doing what's right. It's about showing the world who we are." The airmen nodded, their resolve firm. This was more than just a mission. It was a reminder of everything they had learned and the people who had shaped them. Frank's lessons, his quiet humility, had given them the foundation to become the best versions of themselves. They climbed into the cockpit, the familiar hum of the Mustang's engine filling the air. As the plane taxied down the runway, Staff Sergeant Thomas glanced over at Private Sanders, who sat beside him. "We've got this," Thomas said, his voice low but filled with certainty. Sanders, who had once been unsure of himself, now sat tall, his eyes focused on the task ahead. "Yeah," he replied with a grin. "We've got this." The Mustang lifted off the ground, its powerful engines roaring as it soared into the sky. The airmen could feel the weight of the mission in every turn, every maneuver. This wasn't just a flight. It was a tribute to everything they had become. As the Mustang climbed higher, Staff Sergeant Thomas felt a sense of peace wash over him. The fear that had once consumed him was gone. He wasn't afraid of failure anymore. He wasn't worried about what others thought. He knew that they were ready, that they had prepared for this moment, and that they had earned it. The flight was flawless, the Mustang cutting through the clouds like a bird in flight. Every move they made was deliberate, calculated, and executed with precision. The airmen worked together as a seamless team, their actions reflecting the respect and trust they had built over the past months. As they flew over the countryside, the sun setting in the distance, Staff Sergeant Thomas looked out at the horizon. He thought of Frank, of the lessons the old man had taught them, and of the legacy they were carrying forward. This mission, this flight, was more than just a job. It was a symbol of everything they had worked for. The Mustang wasn't just a plane. It was a reminder of who they were and who they had become. The mission ended as smoothly as it had begun, the Mustang touching down gently on the runway as the team executed a perfect landing. The airmen stepped out of the cockpit, their faces filled with pride. They had done it. They had honored Frank's legacy. They had proven that they were ready to carry the torch forward. The lieutenant approached them, his expression one of quiet pride. "Well done, men," he said. "You did it. You've shown the world who we are." The team stood together, the Mustang now behind them, but the lessons of the past still fresh in their minds. They weren't just airmen anymore. They were a family, bound together by the shared experience of what it meant to serve, to honor the past, and to carry forward the legacy of those who had come before them. As the sun set over the airfield, the airmen knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more missions, more challenges, and more lessons to learn. But they were ready. They had the strength of the past behind them, and the resolve of the present to guide them forward. The Mustang, gleaming in the fading light, was no longer just a plane. It was a symbol of everything they had become and everything they would continue to be. The days following the Mustang's successful mission were filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The airmen, who had once been unsure of themselves, had proven they were ready for any challenge. But despite their success, something within them had shifted. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were living and breathing the legacy that Frank Harrison had instilled in them. They had come a long way since the early days, when they had dismissed the old mechanic as just another relic of the past. Now they understood. Frank hadn't just restored a plane. He had restored their sense of purpose. The hangar had become a place of quiet reverence. Even as new missions came in, the Mustang sat in the corner as a reminder of what they had achieved together. But Staff Sergeant Thomas, though proud of what they had accomplished, couldn't help but feel like there was something more to do. Something they hadn't fully realized yet. "It's not enough just to fix planes, is it?" he asked one evening, his voice thoughtful as he stood by the Mustang, staring at the aircraft's sleek lines. Private Sanders, who had been standing nearby, walked up and joined him. "No," Sanders replied quietly. "It's not. It's about what we're part of, what we're carrying forward." They both turned to look at the Mustang, its metallic body gleaming under the hangar lights. "We've learned a lot," Sanders continued, "but there's still more to do. We can't forget what Frank taught us." Thomas nodded, his mind running through the lessons Frank had passed down to them. Humility, dedication, respect, and above all, the importance of service. They weren't just airmen. They were stewards of something far greater than themselves. The Mustang wasn't just a machine. It was a living piece of history, a legacy that had been handed down through the generations. "What do you think, Lieutenant?" Thomas asked, looking over at the officer who had walked up to join them. The lieutenant, who had been quietly observing the team's growth, smiled. "You've learned well," he said. "But there's one last thing I want you all to understand. It's not just about knowing how to fix planes or fly them. It's about knowing how to carry that knowledge forward. You're part of a tradition now, and that means you have a responsibility." The lieutenant paused, letting his words sink in. "That responsibility doesn't end with you. It's up to you to teach the next generation, to show them what it means to serve, what it means to honor the past." The airmen stood in silence, each of them thinking about the weight of what had been said. They had proven themselves, but they knew their work was far from over. The Mustang was proof of that. It was a living testament to the lessons Frank had taught them, and now it was their turn to pass those lessons on. The next day, the lieutenant called the team together for a briefing. There was a new task ahead, one that would require everything they had learned, everything Frank had passed down to them. "This mission isn't just about success," the lieutenant said, his voice steady and commanding. "It's about ensuring that the legacy of those who came before us continues. It's about making sure that what Frank taught us doesn't end here." The airmen nodded, understanding the gravity of what they were being asked to do. They weren't just following orders. They were continuing a tradition. "We're not just fixing planes today," the lieutenant continued. "We're passing on the knowledge, the skills, and the honor of service to the next generation. It's up to us to make sure they understand the meaning behind this work. It's not just about the aircraft. It's about the history, the pride, and the responsibility we carry." The Mustang was prepared for the mission, its engines humming as it was wheeled out onto the runway. The airmen climbed into their respective positions, each of them feeling the weight of the mission on their shoulders. But this time, there was no fear. There was no hesitation. They were ready. As the Mustang took off, the team watched from the ground, knowing that the work they had done wasn't just for themselves. It was for everyone who had come before them. It was for Frank. It was for those who had flown these planes in a time of war, and it was for the airmen who would one day take their place. As the Mustang soared into the sky, the airmen stood together, their hands on their hearts, their heads held high. They had earned the right to carry this legacy forward. And as the plane disappeared into the horizon, they knew that their work, their dedication, and their respect for the past would live on long after they were gone. The Mustang sat quietly in the hangar, a symbol of everything the airmen had learned and achieved. The airfield had changed, as had the team. What had once been a place where they worked in routine, checking and fixing planes, now felt like a sacred space, a space where legacy and service lived on. The lessons from Frank Harrison, who had passed on his quiet wisdom, were embedded in every action they took, every turn of the wrench, every check of the aircraft. Staff Sergeant Thomas stood beside the Mustang one last time, his hands resting on the cold metal. He had come full circle. The arrogant airman who had once mocked Frank was now a leader of the team, someone who understood that the true value of their work went beyond the mechanics of the planes. It was about what those planes represented, the history they carried, and the honor they held. His eyes lingered on the aircraft as memories of Frank flooded his mind. The quiet moments, the unspoken lessons, the way Frank had moved with purpose and humility, those were the things that had stayed with him. He looked back over at the rest of the team, who were gathered together, checking over the equipment for the final time. They were no longer just a group of young airmen trying to prove themselves. They were a unit, bonded not just by duty, but by the respect they had earned for each other. They had learned that to be part of something bigger than themselves, they had to do their work with integrity, to serve with pride, and to always honor the past. "It's time," the lieutenant said, his voice steady, a quiet pride in his words. "We've done the work. We've honored the legacy. Now, it's time to move forward." Staff Sergeant Thomas nodded, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't just about the Mustang anymore. It was about everything they had built together, everything Frank had taught them. As the team finished their final checks, they gathered around the plane, ready for one last flight. It was a mission, but it was also a tribute. A tribute to Frank, to the men who had come before them, and to the future they would continue to build. The Mustang's engines roared to life once again, filling the hangar with the sound of power. The airmen climbed into their positions, their eyes focused, their hearts aligned. This was their moment. As the plane took to the skies, Staff Sergeant Thomas felt the weight of their journey. The Mustang soared, a symbol of the team's growth, of the lessons they had learned, and of the legacy they had inherited. The clouds parted as the plane climbed higher, the airmen watching from below. It was a perfect flight, the Mustang cutting through the air with ease, its engines singing a song of triumph and respect. The sun began to set as the plane made its final approach, the golden light bathing the runway in a warm glow. The Mustang touched down gently, its wheels kissing the tarmac with the precision of a team that had learned to work together. The engines wound down, and the airmen stood silently, watching the plane come to a complete stop. They had done it. They had completed the mission, but more importantly, they had proven that they were ready to carry on the legacy. The Mustang was no longer just a plane. It was their story, their growth, and their commitment to something greater. The lieutenant walked up to them, his face filled with pride. "You've done it," he said. "You've proven what I've known all along. You're more than just airmen. You're a family, and that's what makes you strong. Now, carry that forward. Keep learning, keep growing, and never forget the lessons you've learned." The airmen nodded, their eyes filled with determination. They had learned that true service was not just about the job. It was about the legacy they carried with them, the respect they showed each other, and the pride they took in their work. As the Mustang sat on the runway, its engines silent, the team stood together, a united front. They had earned their place in the story of the Mustang, and now, it was time for them to pass that story on to the next generation. They had done their part, and they would continue to serve, to honor the past, and to ensure that the legacy of those who had come before them would never be forgotten. The Mustang's shadow stretched long across the runway as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the airmen knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they had become more than just a team. They had become a part of something eternal. This emotional story takes you on a powerful journey through the life of a group of airmen who discover the true meaning of service, humility, and respect. As they learn from an older veteran, Frank Harrison, they come to understand that their work is not just about planes, but about carrying forward a legacy. This emotional story highlights the transformation of the team as they move from arrogance to true dedication, showing how the Mustang aircraft becomes a symbol of their growth. With each challenge they face, the team bonds and grows, and the emotional story unfolds with lessons that will stay with them forever. Their connection to the past, embodied in Frank's quiet wisdom, shapes them into better soldiers and men. As the story progresses, the airmen find themselves ready for their biggest mission yet, proving that they have truly internalized the values that Frank passed on. The emotional story culminates in a tribute to Frank's legacy, reminding us all that service is about more than just completing tasks. It's about carrying a legacy with pride. In the end, this emotional story serves as a testament to the importance of humility, respect, and honoring those who came before us.